ho pensato in realtà a questo seminario, spero di non deludervi, non so se ci sono troppe aspettative, perché non presenterò dei risultati delle cose degli ultimi lavori che sto facendo, ma piuttosto ho pensato di dare un overview al lavoro che ho fatto in passato e più o meno il tema di ricerca che svolgo. E quindi sostanzialmente ho pensato di dividerlo in 3 parti. Nella prima parte, che è una parte abbastanza di introduzione generale, abbiamo detto che quindi è preferibile se switcho in inglese, giusto? Posso... Okay. So the seminar is separated in 3 parts, and the first part I will deal with what are the factors that contribute to set the oceanic nitrogen cycle, and I hope to convince you why are these factors important. Then in the second part, I will show you some modeling experiments where I look into the response of ocean biogeochemistry to anthropogenic stressors, like, for example, the changes in atmospheric CO2 concentration that lead to warming, ocean deoxygenation, and also, for example, the input of atmospheric nitrogen due to anthropogenic activities, like, for example, the use of fertilizers. How do these anthropogenic perturbation would affect the ocean biogeochemistry? And then in the final section, I would look at some conclusions and some future perspective to hope to pick up some of the collaborations with people of Ismar. And so why should we care about nitrogen at all? And nitrogen is the most limiting macronutrient, and which therefore limits biological productivity in the ocean. So what are these? These are surface maps of nitrate and phosphate. The contours represent surface maps of nitrate and phosphate in the ocean taken from World Ocean Atlas, and the little dots represent nutrient limitation experiments. So where you see a green dot, it means that nitrate is the most limiting nutrient. And when there is a red dot, you can see that iron is the most limiting nutrient. And a black dot, it's where phosphate is the most limiting nutrient. And what you can see from these maps, first of all, is that surface nitrate, it's a most limiting, so it finishes earlier than phosphate in the surface ocean. So you can see that it reaches very low concentrations before phosphate does. And then, except for the high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions, which are these green areas where iron is the most, I can show, it's like these green areas here, where iron is the most limiting nutrient. For the rest of the ocean, for the rest of the mid-latitude and low latitude ocean, you can see that nitrate limitation is the most limiting nutrients. So you can see these green dots here, and they're basically in all the subtropical gyre regions, for example, it's nitrate the most limiting nutrients. So what this means is that the change in the nitrogen inventory has strong implications on biological productivity. And in fact, it's thought that changes in the nitrogen inventory have contributed to the past air-sea gas exchange fluxes between, for example, the glacial and interglacial period. So here on these panels are paleoclimate proxies, and it's quite interesting to see that that represent, like in green, it's proxies that represent temperature. In you have iron here, you have CO2, you have N2O, which is another greenhouse gas, and you have the delta 15N, which is a proxy that represents how big is the nitrogen inventory. So it's quite striking that these proxies are quite well correlated, and this has suggested that during the glacial times there was a quite big nitrate inventory that has stimulated a lot of biological productivity, therefore contributing to the drawdown atmospheric CO2. Instead, in the interglacial times, for example here, the nitrate inventory was smaller, and therefore primary productivity would have been smaller, and therefore the atmospheric CO2 drawdown by biological productivity would have been reduced. So this really shows that over long time scales, the size of the nitrogen inventory is really relevant for sustaining biological productivity, and therefore it might have some effect on atmospheric CO2 drawdown. So what are the sources of nitrogen in the ocean? Nitrogen is quite a particular element, because unlike other elements, which are mostly controlled by abiotic factors, nitrogen is controlled by a biotic process, which is called biological nitrogen fixation. Now, this process has a very high energetic cost, and it's carried out by specialized phytoplankton, which require high iron inputs. And this process is it's very like it's the largest source of fixed nitrogen in the ocean, while other sources, for example, like atmospheric deposition or river runoff, have are lower in magnitude. However, nitrogen does not only build up in the ocean. There are also other processes that take care of taking it out of the ocean. So there are other processes that there are a sink of nitrogen to the ocean. And these, again, are biological driven processes. And this biological driven process is what is called denitrification, which is a process that occurs can occur in the water column or in sediments, which have very low oxygen. So what happens in these regions where there is low oxygen, the remineralization of organic matter cannot be carried out by oxygen, because oxygen is limiting. It's limiting. So the remineralization of organic matter is carried out by nitrate. So nitrate is basically substituting the oxygen. So what this means is that the nitrate it's consumed, and it's basically leaving the system. So this is a sink. This process is a sink of nitrogen for the oceans. And this is mostly occurring in low oxygen regions, these so-called oxygen minimum zones that you can see here in these eastern tropical Pacific and in the northern Indian Ocean, where there are basically the combination of low ventilation and high productivity occurring there. So now, we've seen that the climate perturbations, because nitrogen fixation and denitrification are very sensitive to, for example, iron inputs or deoxygenations. Therefore, there are climate perturbations that lead to like changes in iron or changes in the oxygenation clearly can affect significantly these sources and sinks of nitrogen, therefore affecting the nitrogen inventory. For example, it is thought that during the glacial times, there would have been, because dust inputs were larger, nitrogen fixation would have been larger, therefore expanding the nitrogen inventory. However, there are some other theories that suggest rather that during the glacial time, the nitrogen inventory was larger because there was lower losses of nitrogen. There was lower denitrification because, for example, the oxygen was more oxygenated. So these are still hypotheses which are not really clear what is leading what, but this is all really. Nitrogen inventory is extremely sensitive to climate perturbations. Okay, so what are the current input of nitrogen fixation by denitrification is thought to range about between 100 and 200 teragrams of nitrogen per year. Now, this range is quite, so there is still quite a very large uncertainty on this range. However, you can see that this amount is definitely much larger than the amount coming from atmospheric deposition and river runoff. So nitrogen fixation is definitely the major source of nitrogen in the ocean. What about denitrification? Also, denitrification has very high uncertainties ranging between 120 to up to 240 teragrams of nitrogen per year. Probably there is like very high denitrification occurring due to human activities that put extra nitrogen into the system. And the problem is that if denitrification is, of course, larger than nitrogen fixation, it means that the system is losing nitrogen more fast, more quickly than it actually is getting it. And this would mean that the nitrogen inventory would decline, with consequences, of course, for biological productivity. So an essential question in ocean biogeochemistry today is how do these processes, the nitrogen fixation and denitrification, interact so to maintain the nitrogen cycle well in balance, so to have a nitrogen inventory which is not oscillating too much. So in 2008, Gruber came up with this very nice and exciting theory, suggesting that there is the nitrogen inventory undergoes really some self-regulating, stabilizing feedbacks that make sure that the nitrogen inventory is really relative constrained and cannot oscillate too much. And he defined this theory as the nitrogen homeostat. So the nitrogen homeostat builds on the intuition of Redfield, who had seen that the elemental ratios of the nitrate to phosphate to carbon ratio in the ocean are very similar and also constant relative to the elemental ratio of phytoplankton, from which there is like this famous definition of the Redfield ratio, of a constant Redfield ratio of 16:1. So the idea is, for example, if the ocean is losing nitrogen for some perturbation, the system would react in order to refurbish nitrogen back and get back to this N2P ratio of 16:1. So what this means is, for example, if a perturbation reduces the nitrogen, the nitrogen has some increases the nitrogen deficit, you would have low N2P in the ocean. Now, this low N2P would stimulate nitrogen fixation activity, and nitrogen fixers would put nitrogen back into the ocean and therefore would refurbish back the N2P ratio to the 16:1. And similarly, if there is an excess of nitrogen to the system, then the excess nitrogen will be taken off the system by the process of denitrification. And so essentially the system is based on, the set point is based on the Redfield ratio, and you have a system oscillating between low N2P ratio and high N2P ratio, and nitrogen fixation and denitrification compensating each other in order to maintain a balance. So what this means is that to have a quick and very fast compensating mechanism in order to reduce the oscillation of the nitrogen inventory, if there would be a spatial coupling between nitrogen fixation and denitrification, therefore the system would be relatively well in balance. And this is actually what has been thought and actually called the victory by this famous paper in 2007 by Deutsch, who suggested, actually, he diagnosed nitrogen fixation starting from an inverse modeling approach. And he suggested that nitrogen fixtures actually were fixing nitrogen exactly above the regions where there was a loss of nitrogen, above these oxygen minimum zone regions. And therefore, the idea was that if there is regions of denitrification above the oxygen minimum zones, there would be a loss of nitrate, which will be very quickly reset back, refurbished back by nitrogen fixation. So what I did is I tried to understand what are these mechanisms of balancing mechanisms of the nitrogen cycle. And I used a coupled biogeochemical circulation model. It's quite a coarse resolution, but it's a global model. And I carried out 3 model experiments. A model experiments, which I called coupled here, which I simulate a perfect coupling between nitrogen fixation and denitrification, a perfect spatial coupling. And then I have another simulation, which I called iron, where I reduce the spatial coupling between nitrogen fixation and denitrification, adding, for example, iron limitations to diisotrophs, so that nitrogen fixers, diisotroph is another way of expressing nitrogen fixers, so that nitrogen fixers cannot respond to this nitrogen deficit because they're limited by iron. And then I have another simulation, which I called DOM, which I include the dynamics of dissolved organic matter. What I want to show you here on the right-hand side is that there is a nitrogen inventory change, and very unexpectedly, the largest nitrogen inventory change, which is negative, so there is a loss relative to initial conditions, the largest nitrogen loss occurs in the model simulation where nitrogen fixation and denitrification are spatially coupled. And so at the beginning, I was quite puzzled about this. And I was like, oh, what is happening? I was expecting if these two processes were coupled, then they should make sure that the nitrogen inventory is well in balance and there shouldn't be any losses of nitrogen. However, to understand really what's happening is that you have to look at the stoichiometry of the process of which are occurring. So essentially what happens is that when you remerize organic matter by nitrate, what you're doing is that you're remerizing, let's say, 16 moles of nitrogen, but actually you're consuming 60 moles of N2, or that makes 120 moles of nitrogen. So what it means that when you remerize by denitrification, you're of course consuming more nitrates that you're actually putting into the system. So what happens in this model simulation where the ocean loses nitrogen very quickly, which has been defined the so-called vicious cycle, what happens is that denitrification produces a nitrogen deficit, which stimulates by a positive feedback nitrogen fixation. Now, nitrogen fixation produces organic matter, which stimulates denitrification back in a vicious circle. However, the problem is that for every circle that goes around, you have more nitrogen that is lost through denitrification than actually nitrogen that is fixed through nitrogen fixation. So what this essentially is saying is that when you have a perfect spatial coupling between these two processes, which in theory, according to the nitrogen homeostat, to make sure that the nitrogen inventory would not be drawn down, you're actually getting the opposite. You're actually getting, when there is a spatial coupling, you have a very large and quickly nitrogen loss from the ocean. So what you need is that you need a process that actually allow a decoupling of these two processes, which can either occur through iron. For example, here, if I have a denitrification signal, I have this nitrogen deficit that stimulates, that should stimulate nitrogen fixation, but because they are iron limited, this nitrogen deficit can be advected away, and organic matter produced by nitrogen fixation can be remerized by oxygen. And similarly, if I have dissolved organic matter dynamics, I would also have a spatial decoupling over the vertical. So what this really has, what these experiments have shown is that this theory of a nitrogen homeostat, the spatial coupling really is weakening the nitrogen homeostat, and it's making weaker the mechanisms that regulate the nitrogen inventory. So, so what this means in terms of the implications for the past and future regulation of the nitrogen inventory is that we have to take into consideration not only the amount of fixed nitrogen and the amount of denitrification occurring, but also their spatial relationship. and their spatial relationship can definitely be changed and be somehow changed by the current perturbations, like, for example, changes in dust deposition patterns, which change the amount of iron that is inputted into the ocean, or changes in temperatures due to warming, and also changes in the expansion of oxygen minimum zones. So now I get into the second part of my my presentation, where I want to show you what is the response of ocean biogeochemistry to climate perturbations. And the perturbation that I will consider is for the change in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, which lead to warming and lead also to ocean deoxygenation. And also I will consider it separately, but first in a separate manner, and then combining the two perturbations, I will also consider the changes in the amount of nitrogen that is deposited to the ocean due to, for example, to anthropogenic activities, like, for example, the use of fertilizer, or pollution, or the use of fertilizers and everything that basically produces a pollution of nitrogen in the atmosphere. And the question I want to ask now is, what is the net effect of these combined perturbations on the nitrogen cycle, on marine productivity, and also I will also have an eye on the nitrogen oxides, the N2O, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So what is the effect of these perturbations on the emissions of N2O from the oceans on centennial timescales? And to do this, to look into this question, I will use a different tool, and I will use an Earth system model of intermediate complexity, the UVIC 2.9. And this is still a coarse resolution model, and it has I implemented an explicit interactive nitrogen cycle, and it has nitrogen oxides parameterization. And I will show you the simulation starting from the industrial period in 1800 to the end of the century. And I will show you the results of 3 experiments. In a first experiment, which I called warm, and it's indicated by red, I apply the changes in atmospheric concentrations of CO2 and N2O forcing. So what this means is that in this simulation, I simulate the changes in warming and circulation and deoxygenation due to warming. In a second simulation, which I call NDEP, what I do is I do not apply changes in atmospheric CO2 concentrations and N2O concentrations, but I keep these atmospheric concentrations at pre-industrial level. But what I do is that I apply changes in nitrogen deposition following a future scenario. So the nitrogen deposition increases every year due to anthropogenic activity. And then finally, I will show a simulation, which I call full, which takes into consideration the combination of these two perturbations. So let's see what is the effect of warming in the ocean in general and ocean biogeochemistry. So these plots here is global averages of parameters from 1850 to the end of the century. Of course, when I change the atmospheric forcing of CO2 and N2O, what I see is that there is an increase in sea surface temperature. And this increase in sea surface temperature is also reflected in changes in stratification. So there's greater stratification, which has an effect on changes in mixed layer depth. So the mixed layer depth in the ocean on averages gets shallower. And here I have nitrogen limitation and phosphorus limitation, and both the limitation by these nutrients increase over time. And the oxygen content in the ocean due to warming, and this is an effect of reduced ventilation, reduced solubility, and also changes in ocean biogeochemistry lead to an overall, an overall oxygen decline. So let's see what happens to the biogeochemistry part. So here it's indicated in the full line, primary production, and in the dashed line, expert production. So what is interesting is that primary production changes over time, and it increases from, let's say, starting from year 2000 to 2000 and by the end of the century. And this is quite interesting because primary production is responding to changes in temperature, in warming. So what warming does is that it enhances the metabolic rate, so it enhances growth rate of phytoplankton, and therefore phytoplankton grows faster. But it also enhances remineralization by bacteria that is also temperature dependent. So what happens is that primary production at the surface ocean it grows because of a temperature effect. However, what is interesting is that expert production instead, it declines over time. And this is due to the fact because you have an increase in stratification, and the increase in stratification reduces the influx of nutrients from the thermocline to the surface euphotic layer. So you see that there is a decoupling. It's quite interesting that there is a decoupling between primary production and expert production. So when we look at nitrogen fixation, what happens is that nitrogen fixation does change a little, but it's not really changing excessively. Although one of the expectation would be is that because nitrogen is becoming more limiting and temperature are increasing, and so that would be create the perfect conditions for nitrogen fixtures to grow. However, what we see is that nitrogen fixtures don't grow as expected, but actually they become very quickly phosphorus limited. And then let's look at the process of denitrification, which is responsible of the sink of nitrogen in the ocean. So what you see is that in the continuous line, it's represented water column denitrification. So the denitrification that occurs in these oxygen minimum zones that I was showing you before. And generally, you can see that there is a sort of decline, then an increase that follows very well the change in the oxygen minimum zone volume. So here at the bottom is the volume of oxygen minimum zone, which is declining and then increasing at the end by about 21%. So you can see that a water column denitrification, this continuous line, is actually also increasing by the end of the century. However, it's quite interesting that the denitrification that it's occurring in the sediments is actually declining. And this is due to the fact that the expert production is declining. So essentially there is less organic material that sinks at depth and is remineralized and denitrified by denitrification. So let's see what happens if we consider, oops, what's happening here? If we consider, let's see what happens if we consider the nitrogen deposition perturbation. So nitrogen deposition experiment, we said that what I did in this experiment, I left the circulation, basically it doesn't reflect the changes in warming, the changes in climate, so the circulation stays the same, and therefore temperature stays the same, mixed layer depth stay the same, and essentially nutrient limitation does not change very much. And also oxygen, because most of the physics is staying the same, also oxygen is not changing very much. What happens is that the input of nitrogen to the system does increase both primary production and expert production, but this increase is quite small. It's just about 1%. Now, this is quite interesting because it has been always unclear what would the input of nitrogen to the ocean be. For example, there is a lot of ideas that a way to fertilize the ocean is put additional nitrogen into the ocean. But from these experiments, you can see that if you do put additional nitrogen in the ocean, it doesn't really affect productivity significantly. So the fertilization effect is really very low, and we're going to see why. First of all, because when you put nitrogen into the ocean, the first thing that happens is that nitrogen fixtures are reduced. So the input of nitrogen from nitrogen fixation is reduced. And this is because the nitrogen fixtures, they have less nitrogen limiting environment where they can succeed. But the other very interesting part is that when you put nitrogen into the ocean by, for example, atmospheric deposition, what increases is denitrification losses, both by water column here and benthic denitrification. So at the end, if you do put nitrogen into the ocean, for example, if you want to fertilize the ocean, what happens is that the ocean takes care of getting rid of this extra nitrogen that you put in. So with very limited effects on fertilization. And this is something, for example, quite important because it's now with these geoengineering experiments and idea how to mitigate climate change, there are some of these ideas that how to fertilize the ocean. And so you have to consider also these feedback mechanisms that make sure to sort of compensate each other. So in the end, what we see is that how will the nitrogen inventory change by the end of the century? So what we see is that there is a series of feedback mechanisms that make sure that the nitrogen inventory is held in relative well balance. So actually these experiments do show that there is a sort of nitrogen homeostat, a series of mechanisms that auto-regulate itself. So as I said, if you do put nitrogen deposition, so this is changes relative to 1800. So positive changes means increases, and negative changes means a decrease relative to the pre-industrial condition. So if you do increase the amount of nitrogen deposition from atmospheric inputs due, for example, to activities like use of fertilizers, what happens is that these nitrogen inputs are very quickly compensated by a loss of nitrogen inputs by nitrogen fixation and an increase on nitrogen losses by denitrification. It is interesting, though, to see that benthic denitrification is sort of decoupled from water column denitrification, and this responds to the fact that there has been a change in export production. However, so overall, the balance of the nitrogen cycle is relative well in place. It's relative stable. So what this is really saying is that there are a feedback mechanism that occur on centennial timescale that make sure that the system is relative stable. Now, looking at what happens at productivity changes by the end of the century, what we see this interesting effect of temperature on one side enhancing primary productivity in most of the ocean region, except for some regions. But overall, there is a 3% increase in primary production. However, due to the reduced input of nutrients from the thermocline to the euphotic layer, you have a net effect of declining export production. So it's really interesting, I think, that there is a decoupling between primary production and export production. So the trends among these two processes are basically decoupled and need to be considered. Okay, I will move now into the let's say the last part that of this these results, where I want to show you how will nitrogen oxides emissions change by these perturbation experiments by the end of the century. So nitrogen oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas which has a radiative potential of 300 times larger than atmospheric CO2, but it has about it has much lower concentrations relative to CO2. That's why it's not so important at the moment. However, over the pre-industrial period up to now, the atmospheric N2O concentration have increased by about 22%, reaching, I think, I didn't check this very lately, so this is maybe a little bit outdated, but reaching about 325 ppb in the atmosphere. So what is important about this greenhouse gas is that a third of this gas is a third of the natural production of this gas is produced in the ocean. The production and consumption of this gas in the ocean is extremely sensitive to the oxygen condition, the oxidation state of the ocean. And it's also, again, carried out by biological processes, which are nitrification and denitrification. So I don't want to get into the detail of these biological processes, but just want you to know that these are very oxygen sensitive. And so there is very big interest on what will happen if this nitrogen gas produced in the ocean will increase, the emissions by the oceans will increase. And this is due to the fact that the ocean is reducing. So the oceanic oxygen content is reducing. So there is quite a lot of interest in trying to understand if deoxygenation actually can accelerate global warming, because it would enhance the production of this greenhouse gas under low oxygen conditions. So this is what I put here in this figure is the Kiel Declaration on Ocean Deoxygenation. So it is clear that the ocean is deoxygenating. It's still not totally clear what are the factors that are contributing, at least quantitatively, what are the factors that are contributing to this deoxygenation. But there is also a very big interest in trying to understand what are the effects of this deoxygenation on, for example, the production of this greenhouse gas in the ocean. So what I did is I carried out these perturbation experiments. And what I want you to show is that very unexpectedly, this is oceanic nitrogen 2 emissions starting from the pre-industrial condition to the end of the century. And again, I show you the experiments WARM, where I apply global warming, the nitrogen deposition experiment, where I don't apply the changes in atmospheric CO2, but it's just applying the changes in the nitrogen deposition. And then the full, where I combine these two perturbations. And what you can see is that unexpectedly, when I look at the simulations that include basically warming, what happens is that the oceanic emissions actually declined by 24%. And I did another sensitivity simulation here in green, which I called gas exchange, which essentially shows that half of this decline is due to the fact that the atmospheric N2O concentrations are increasing. So basically the air-sea gas exchange is affected. But so very unexpectedly, although ocean oxygen content is reducing, the emissions of this greenhouse gas are going to be reduced. And this result is consistent also with other results from other experiments, IPCC type model that have been used for the CMIP-5 climate model intercomparison project. So these experiments these results are consistent also with other published data. So it's quite puzzling to understand what is happening there. And essentially, this is a combination of physical factors. So there is a slowdown of ozone circulation. There is an increasing the stratification. So the amount of nitrogen oxides in the ocean, so the inventory is actually increasing due to this fact. And this can be seen. So this is the nitrogen oxide inventory, and this is shown by this continuous line, you see that in the climate perturbation experiments, this inventory is increasing. However, the production, so the biological production of this gas is actually reducing, and you can see this by these dashed line here in these climate perturbation experiments, which indicates that this is the effect of reduced export production. So although the biological production of nitrogen oxide is decreasing in the ocean, the inventory is increasing, and this is due to the physical processes, for example, changes in ocean circulation and increase in stratification. So the overall effect is that there is an emission, the emissions of this greenhouse gas are actually declining. So sort of concluding, what happens is that when we look at these perturbation experiments, and if we combine perturbation experiments, we realize that there are emerging feedbacks that make sure that where you have an interactions of the nitrogen, the carbon, and the oxygen cycle, and there are compensating mechanisms that are physical, biological, and chemical compensating mechanisms that really make sure that there is little nitrogen flux change over the next, by the end of the century, and that there is a emission, nitrogen oxide emission decline over the century. Now, this figure here, I don't want to get into the details, but I just want you to show that for every arrow, it means that there is a feedback mechanism, and it's a positive arrow, it's a plus, it's a positive feedback mechanism. And if there is a negative, there is a negative feedback mechanism. So you can see that there is a myriad of processes acting, sort of compensating one another, going from MOC intensity and stratification. So it's physical, biological, and also chemical processes. And I'm not sure what's the time. I'm not sure if to go into this slide, but okay, just quickly. So this is work in progress. So I wanted to understand really what are the factors that, yeah, I'm really nearly over time. So what are the factors that really are contributing to this decline in nitrogen oxide emissions? Because I wasn't expecting this to occur. So to disentangle the individual contribution of the physical, the biological, and the chemical processes, what I'm doing actually is that I'm carrying out different model experiments where I try to keep certain factors and certain forcing constant. So I'm not going to get into the details of the method, but basically what I wanted to show you is that this is the nitrogen oxide flux change relative to the nitrogen oxide change from 1800 to 2100. And so the values that are positive here are those processes that are actually contributing to an increase in the emissions of nitrogen oxides. And the process here that are negative are processes that are contributing to a decline in the emissions of nitrogen oxides. So what you can see that the net is this black line here. So you can see that there is a sort of compensation of all these mechanisms that make sure that the nitrogen oxide emissions are actually declining. But process like, for example, in pink, you have deoxygenation or temperature or solubility. These processes would all contribute to an increase in nitrogen oxide emissions. However, the changes in circulation and export production are overwhelming and actually overcompensate these increases in the emissions and lead to a net decline in nitrogen oxide emissions. And so what are the conclusions? What I hope I could have showed you is that I convinced you about is that the nitrogen inventory is important, and because it controls ocean productivity and ocean carbon uptake, and it also controls the nitrogen inventory. And that what is really important is that the nitrogen inventory is maintained by a balance between nitrogen fixation and denitrification processes. But it's really important to understand how these processes interact in order to keep a nitrogen homeostatic, in order to keep the nitrogen inventory stable. and under future perturbations. And also it's really important to understand on what time scale this is occurring. So from these perturbation experiments that I've showed you is that I can say that over centennials time scale, there are complex interacting feedback mechanisms that make sure that the nitrogen inventory is kept in balance and that nitrogen oxide emissions are actually declining, and that these processes are active on centennial timescales. So what is the ongoing work and future perspective? So one of the current challenge is to develop accurate predictive tools that take into consideration the complex interaction between the combination of multiple stressors. So here I only considered, for example, the change in atmospheric CO2 concentration, which would lead to warming and deoxygenation, and also the changes in atmospheric nitrogen deposition. But there are other changes that I am actually considering, which is work in progress. For example, what is the effect of ocean acidification on carbon storage, or the effect of Southern Ocean wind changes, which changes the input of nutrients into the thermocline, also changes in the iron deposition due to increased or reduced or changes in the water cycle, basically. And another work I'm carrying out, which I'm collaborating to, is, for example, to look at what happens if we do consider plastic pollution on ocean biogeochemistry. So plastic pollution, from an ocean biogeochemical point of view, it does actually affect the sinking speed of organic matter, and therefore it affects where the organic matter is remineralized in the water column and where the oxygen is consumed. So plastic pollution may, in the end, also affect the oxygenation of the ocean. So this is things that I'm doing at the moment, and it's work in progress. So the idea, of course, for the future is trying to reduce uncertainties in climate projections. So there are climate projections, for example, which don't have a full explicit nitrogen cycle, but we've seen that the nitrogen cycle plays a very big role, not only for the carbon, but also the oxygen projections. And there are still very open questions. For example, what are the controls of nitrogen fixation? So nitrogen fixation, there has been a lot of research going on in the last decade. So there's a lot of things that have been learned, but still there are still open questions. And there is still a discrepancy between model and observations. And we really don't quite yet know what our model's missing in order to really capture the observations correctly. And this is definitely very important, as I said, for climate projections in the future. Again, there is very big open question on what are the causes of deoxygenation. So let's say I don't want to say, there is like a very large percentage of ocean deoxygenation that can be explained, but still there is a small percentage that cannot really be explained. And so we are still in the search of some maybe potential feedback mechanism or amplifying mechanisms that allow the ocean to deoxygenate as much as it's doing. Again, there is a discrepancy between the model and observations. So from observations, the ocean is oxygenating faster than what models can predict. And we are still trying to understand why that's the case. And one of the reasons also that we want to understand this is to understand past anoxic events. So in the past, there has been this great anoxic event, which where the oxygen was mostly anoxic, and we still don't understand what are the factors that contributed to these anoxic events. And finally, what is interesting also to understand is what's really the impact of nitrogen oxide production in the ocean, and if there is going to be a tipping point where nitrogen oxide production is actually going to be like all this nitrogen oxide that is accumulating in the ocean, at some point it will get back to the atmosphere and have an effect on the radiative forcing of the Earth. And of course, all these works and future works, which I hope to to take over are very much in line with the incipit, let's say, of the UN Decade for Ocean Sciences, where scientific understanding of the ocean response to ocean anthropogenic pressure is basically fundamental for a sustainable development. And with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't bore you too much. Thanks a lot.